Hello, this is Scotland at 7. It's Wednesday the 16th of February. In the studio tonight, you've got myself, Hugh, Stewart, and I'm joined by Brian Liddy, and we'll be discussing the news. So first of all, Brian, straight into our top story. The United States and NATO say Russia was still building up troops around Ukraine, despite Moscow's insistence it was pulling back, questioning President Vladimir Putin's stated desire to negotiate a solution to the crisis. In Ukraine, where people raised flags and played the national anthem to show unity against fears of an invasion, the government said a cyber attack that hit the defence ministry was the worst of its kind, which the country had seen. It pointed the finger towards Russia, which denies involvement. The Russian Defence Ministry said its forces were pulling back after exercises in southern and western military districts near Ukraine, a part of a huge military build-up which was accompanied by demands for sweeping security guarantees from Washington and NATO. It published videos saying that tanks, infantry, fighting materials, vehicles and self-propelled artillery units were leaving the Crimean Peninsula, which Moscow seized from Ukraine in 2014. But US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said key Russian units were moving towards the border and not away. In an interview on MSNBC, Secretary Blinken said that that's what Russia says and that's what Russia does. We haven't seen any pullback of its forces. A senior Western intelligence official said the risk of Russian aggression against Ukraine would remain high for the rest of February, and Russia could still attack Ukraine, essentially with a no or little to no warning. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg said moving troops and tanks back and forth did not amount to proof of a pullout. Russia says it never planned to attack Ukraine, but wants to lay down its red lines to prevent its neighbour from joining NATO, which it sees as a threat to its own security. The Kremlin said Putin was keen to negotiate with the United States, which has offered discussions on arms control and confidence-building measures while ruling out a veto on the future NATO membership for Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said he did not see any sign of a Russian troop withdrawal. President Zelensky had designated Wednesday, that's today, a patriotic holiday in response to reports that Russia could invade today. Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said Putin had taken note of the request from the Russian parliament on Tuesday for him to recognise the independence of the two breakaway regions in eastern Ukraine where Russian-backed separatists have been fighting the Ukrainian government forces since 2014. But he said that would not be in line with the agreements aimed at ending the conflict in which Ukraine says some 15,000 people have been killed, indicating Putin would not rush to recognise those separatist areas, but might keep it as an option in reserve. Blinken said such a step would undermine Ukraine's sovereignty, violate international law, and necessitate a swift and firm response from the United States in coordination with allies and partners. So, Brian, it looks like there's solidarity, I would say firm solidarity between NATO and the European Union and the US. In fact, the Chancellor of Germany has been in Ukraine recently. Does it look as if all sides in the West are standing firm and backing Ukraine?
That would seem to be the case, Hugh. To be watching it unfolding live, it's almost like a game of chess. It's unfolding, in real life and in real time, but with a lot at stake, including Ukraine's sovereignty and perhaps human life and conflict. So it's quite nerve-wracking. One of the statements that I took from recent days is that we need to be prepared for the worst, or Europe and NATO, the EU and NATO and the West needs to be prepared for the worst, but we still have to hold out hope that there is going to be a diplomatic solution. And it would seem that the meeting, I think it was just yesterday, between Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, he met Putin in Moscow yesterday, and there was quite good sounds coming out of that. That was when we found out that Putin had announced that there would be partial withdrawal of troops from what he called exercises. Russia still keeps claiming that they're not planning to invade and that these are just military exercises. But recent footage has shown that some tanks and the like have retreated, but there's been more troops going in the opposite direction. So although there have been some movements away from the border, there's been greater movements towards the border. And apparently of those tank divisions, there were 3 tank divisions that Putin was referring to that have withdrawn. But only one of them is based far away from the Ukraine. The other 2 are really, their full-time bases are nearby. So it does just seem like a huge game of cat and mouse.
Yes, it does look like that, and I suppose what we're hoping is that there will be some sort of negotiated solution. Was that what Olaf Scholz was trying to do? There were rumours the other day that Olaf Scholz was saying to Ukraine, well, OK, in principle you might have the right to join NATO, but it would be a good idea if you just drop that at the moment. Is that a possible way out?
I think that's fair enough. It's I think Russia would take it as a reason to escalate. I think if the Ukraine was allowed to join NATO, if you consider countries that are already members of NATO, like Finland, they will. Oh, sorry. Well, I think I've gotten this wrong here. I think they purposely refused to join NATO as a signal to Russia, because they share Finland shares a border with Russia, so they purposely say we're not going to join NATO, so we're not a threat, so please don't invade us. And so I think maybe that's the kind of situation that they're trying to put in place for the Ukraine.
Yes, so Ukraine, of course, nonetheless has the sovereign right to join whoever it wants to join. So, of course, the West's position is that it's not up to Putin to put limits on what Ukraine wants to do. But it was suggested that was one of the negotiating tactics that Olaf Scholz might use. But it is in the Ukrainian constitution anyway that if they can join NATO if they want to, of course.
And of course, Ukraine, they also want to join the European Union as well. But obviously that's something that would take a lot more time. I think it's a long-term ambition, I would imagine.
Yeah, but certainly the European side in Ukraine, the pro-Western side, if you like, has been strengthened, hasn't it? Do you think there's some sense in which Putin has actually shot himself in the foot? What he has succeeded in doing is uniting Ukraine in the Western side. There's very few people, at least outside of those Russian-speaking areas in the east, there's very few people in Kiev right now who are going to support Russia, are they?
Yeah, possibly, but I think that may well be the case, but I think Putin will still probably be taking quite a lot of pleasure out of the fact that there is so much of what he would probably call an overreaction. So basically, it's like we're on the defensive here, I suppose, really. So I think he would take solace in that. Rather than, which might counter any ideas of anything that he does strengthening Europe and the West. Quid pro quo, or you take from it whatever you want, really. You pay your money and you take your choice.
Some defence analysts I've been hearing on the radio have been suggesting that Putin, like other dictators in his position, has to first of all look after himself. What he wants is to die peacefully in his bed in 10 years, 20 years' time. So for that to happen, he has to be offered a way out. Do you think there's some way in the negotiations where Putin can withdraw and somehow sell it as a victory?
Well, it's an interesting question. I'm not sure, because I think as long as as long as Putin still claims that these are only training manoeuvres and with no plans to invade, then again it's back to that cat and mouse thing again. He might invade, Russia might invade, or they might just eventually just withdraw, and then they'll say, well, that's what we were going to do anyway, you overreacted as usual, and he can then use that at home to say, look, that's the West, saber rattling, we only had peaceful intentions. So he would win from that at home, I would imagine.
Well, certainly that's true that the exercises, military exercises involving Belarus were time limited, 10 days, I think. I don't know when that runs up, but that must be finished
soon,
in a couple of days, actually. So that means that could, of course, be just an announcement saying we said we were doing an exercise and it's finished, and now we're going home again. So, but nonetheless, they're still keeping over, I think, 130,000. There have been, in spite of the announcement of withdrawals, there has been an increase in troops around the Ukraine border over the last week.
Yeah, President Biden puts it at something like 150,000, but I think that's up. But apparently another thing I was reading today is part of Russia's modus operandi is that they'll move lots of troops towards the border with lots of equipment and hardware like guns and tanks and the like, and then they'll declare that there's going to be a withdrawal and the troops will withdraw, or a number of troops will withdraw, but they'll leave the hardware there as if to say, that's in place for future use. And
Yep.
so it's there's a lot going on. And then, of course, there's been satellite photographs recently of pontoon bridges recently that have appeared, which is, again, quite an ominous sign of potentially what might be to come.
Yep, so the gear still remains. Just finally, I suppose this is an optimistic note. The British government reported that there's been no increase in people looking for British passports. So there was the suggesting if people in Ukraine actually thought that an invasion was imminent, they'd be heading for the airports, but that's not happening. So people in Kiev and Lviv are staying put and celebrating their nationality today.
I would perhaps suggest that's because they realise that this isn't maybe the best country to come to if they were thinking about moving.
Such a cynic, Brian. OK, we'll move on now to our second story tonight. There has been renewed calls today for Prince Andrew to be stripped of his peerage titles following yesterday's announcement that he had settled the sex assault case filed against him by Virginia Giuffre for a sum which some reports say could be as much as $12 million, that's in dollars. Last month, the Queen stripped Prince Andrew of his military affiliations and royal patronages in an attempt to distance the royal family from his allegations. However, he keeps the Duke of York and Earl of Inverness titles. Removal of the titles would have it would have to be led by Parliament through a statute passed by both the House of Commons and the Lords. The Labour MP for York Central, Rachel Maskell, who raised concerns about the Duke of York's title in the Commons last month, said that her mailbox was absolutely rammed with people demanding that Andrew be stripped of the titles. There are hopes he might voluntarily renounce the titles to avoid further embarrassment to the Queen in her Platinum Jubilee year. However, if he does not, it seems likely that there will be many MPs wanting to pursue the necessary legislation when Parliament returns from recess. So, Brian, opinion polls that I've read today suggest that most people in England and Scotland are really quite disgusted by Andrew, but it looks like the whole idea of the monarchy itself, as far as I know, hasn't shifted much, although we haven't had any opinion polls on republicanism recently. But I think what they're trying to do is to kind of cut off the Andrew scandal from the monarchy itself. They're trying to kind of insulate the two. Do you think that's working?
It's too soon to tell if it's working, but I don't think it will work. I'll just start by saying I think maybe it's a shame that Giuffre didn't do what she first said she was going to do and see it through so that she would get her day in court. But leaving that aside, let's take it from where we are. You're absolutely right that the Queen can't remove Andrew's titles individually. It has to go through Parliament, and there's talk about that there may well be new legislation that might have to be brought in this summer, and if that's the case, then that would clash with the Queen's Platinum Jubilee year.
So do you think that's the main reason for the surprise announcement yesterday that the case has been settled for a lot of money? Is it really because of the Jubilee celebrations?
Yeah, I know that social media isn't a hard and fast source of facts, but there's quite a lot of people on social media that are disappointed that the Queen has decided that it's more important that her Jubilee should go ahead without any blemishes, and that she's been willing to bankroll her son to the tune of £12 million. So you would like to think that if she had any morals, then she would think that her Jubilee celebration was less important than what her son may or may not have done, because again he still claims that he's totally innocent, and that's why I think it's a shame that it didn't go to court. But I think the fact is that this story is not over yet, and I think it may well still clash with the celebrations in the summer.
Well, it doesn't look good. We don't know, of course, if it was 12 million. Various papers have been suggesting that figure, and so and we don't know entirely where the money is going to come from. It also has been reported that the Queen will put up a substantial amount of the sum, whatever it is, but again, we don't know what percentage. So I suppose it's follow the money is what they always say in these stories, but that's not going to be very easy to do.
Yeah.
We have heard tonight, by the way, from the Telegraph that the Duke of York will keep his remaining titles, according to the Telegraph. He retains his dukedom, and he will continue to be a Vice Admiral in the Navy. So that's the story we hear tonight. He's sticking to that.
I think my response to that is like that may be what Prince Andrew wants, but it might not be what Prince Andrew gets. I don't think it's going to be up to Prince Andrew whether he gets to keep his titles or not. And again, most of the press that's been generated around this about whether Andrew should be able to keep his titles is mainly British press, the mainstream media as it's often called. And so they're concentrating on Andrew's main title of the Duke of York, but of course here in Scotland he has a different title, which is the Earl of Inverness, and I would like to see that title also being brought into discussions about whether he should be able to maintain or be able to keep that title alongside. And if he loses the Duke of York title, then I think he should also lose the Earl of Inverness title.
Yes, I should have looked up who's the MP or MSPs for the areas around Inverness, because it is possible, of course, even if Parliament doesn't move. It's was that Drew Henry, of course. Yeah, thank you. I've just heard Drew Henry. I wonder what we must ask Drew Henry what his opinion is on this for Inverness. It is possible, of course, for citizens to raise a petition up to £10,000. 10,000. Excuse me, 10,000 signatures gets a petition discussed by the government, and up to 100,000 means it has to be timetabled for Parliament. So even if the MPs don't want to move, 100,000 signatures would see it discussed. So we must ask Drew Henry what his opinion is on that.
Yeah, and so as I said, this story isn't going to go away, I don't think. And just a little point of comparison. So let's say it is £12 million. It's as good a figure as any, and that seems to be the one that most sources are quoting. So if that is the case, that works out to be about $16 million, roughly, give or take, one or two. If you think back to something that was comparable for a similar crime, then you think about Michael Jackson. He settled out of court in American courts for $15 million, so $1 million less than the rumoured $16 million that's being talked about for Prince Andrew. Okay, so that gives you an idea of the scale of the payments that we're talking about.
So it's definitely a major scandal affecting the royal family again. And that brings us to our third story tonight, Brian. Scotland Yard has launched an investigation into a cash for honours allegation linked to the Prince of Wales' charity foundation, the Prince's Foundation. In a brief statement, the Met Police said it has launched an investigation following media reports alleging offers of help were made to secure honours and citizenship for a Saudi national. In September last year, the Sunday Times published claims that the billionaire Mahfouz Marai Mubarak bin Mahfouz paid tens of thousands of pounds to fixers with links to Prince Charles, who told him they could secure him an honour. Bin Mahfouz was awarded a CBE in a private ceremony at Buckingham Palace in November 2016. The Met said it had received a letter in September last year relating to the media reports, and after further inquiries launched an investigation into the allegations of offences under the Honours Prevention of Abuses Act of 1925. There have been no arrests or interviews under caution, the force added. Clarence House reiterated its previous statement, saying, "The Prince of Wales has no knowledge of the alleged offer of honours or British citizenship on a basis of donations to his charities," while a spokesperson for the Prince's Foundation said it would be inappropriate to comment on an ongoing investigation. Bin Mahfouz has been one of the most prolific donors to the Prince's charities, and even has a forest named after him, the Mahfouz Wood at the 15th century castle of May, formerly the Queen Mother's home, and now one of the Prince's Scottish residences. Donations of more than 1.5 million helped fund restorations of residences used by Charles and other charitable ventures. The Prince's Foundation publicly lists Mahfouz as a patron. When the allegations surfaced, the Prince's Foundation launched an internal investigation, which in turn led to one of Prince Charles's closest aides, Michael Fawcett, temporarily stepping down as the Foundation chief executive. The Met said officers had liaised with the Prince's Foundation about the findings of the independent investigation into fundraising practices. So cash with honours back, cash for honours back again. As far as I know, this is the first time that the Prince has been linked with it. So how many more royal scandals do you think the monarchy can survive this year?
Yeah, some of the press are saying that this has been a tough week for the royals, which to me kind of translates into it's a great day to be British. So this is an interesting one. I've been kind of looking a little bit more into, I think most of the press coverage has been about Bin Mahfouz, which is right and proper if he has been giving cash in return for honours. And British citizenship, I believe, as well, was part of the alleged deal. But I think Mr. Fawcett's an interesting character. Mr. Fawcett, Prince Charles's aide, he started his career in the royal household in 1981 when he became a footman to the Queen. And you might remember quite some time back, he then rose to become Charles's valet. He would lay out the Prince's clothes in the morning, pretty much decide what he would get to wear that day. Fawcett was, I haven't written down the year, but he was accused, you might remember, of selling unwanted royal gifts quite some time ago when he was the Prince's aide. Not only that, but allegedly he would then take a cut from the money that he made from these gifts that he sold.
What, was he putting this stuff on eBay?
I don't know if that existed then. If it did, it would have been fledgling, but maybe he kind of helped it to become what it is now. They had an internal inquiry about what had gone on there within the royal household, and of course he was cleared. And there were also allegations of bullying that were made, that Mr. Fawcett was a bully, but as I said, allegations, nothing substantial. He then resigned from his position then, but the royal household continued to give him employment in a freelance basis for organising events and the like. And now it seems it's become, he now runs the Prince's Foundation on behalf of Prince Charles, which then leads me to wonder, clearly Prince Charles trusts Mr. Fawcett a great deal. Even after the claims of bullying and the selling of unwanted royal gifts, perhaps that would be considered a useful thing for an aide in the royal family. I'm not sure what. I'm sure they get given all sorts of things that they don't want to really give space to in the house. But I would wonder if he's that close, if Fawcett is that close to Charles, and if he is trusted enough to run the Prince's Foundation, then surely something of this magnitude, a donor asking for honours in British citizenship, and he did get the CBE in 2016, as you said, then I'm sure that would have been run past the Prince at the time. I can't see that all going through the usual channels without it being passed up the chain to some degree.
That would be a surprise. Yeah.
And you mentioned, just quickly, because I know time is correct, you mentioned the original cash for honours, which was, how do we look at that? 2006, 2007 that happened, when Tony Blair was Prime Minister and we had a Labour government. That came about from after complaints submitted by the SNP's MP Angus MacNeil, amongst others, that loans were, the loans that were taken by Labour at the time were repaid, they were made to be repaid, which led to the Labour Party going into financial difficulty. And it's more or less understood that cash for loans scandal severely undermined Tony Blair and hastened his demise as Prime Minister. So again, it just shows you how serious perhaps Prince Charles's situation is at the moment, if it does go further.
Yep. So I wonder what effects this is going to have on the monarchy, who are obviously going to try and try a big charm offensive. We get a 4-day weekend for the Queen's Jubilee. However, I read that as far as the most recent figures I could find from last June show that most Scots would be, well, I haven't got figures on whether people are in favour of a monarchy or an elected head of state. I don't know if you've got anything like that. But certainly most Scots do not believe that the monarchy should intervene in Scottish politics. In a survey from last June, 49% of Scots thought an intervention in politics would be unacceptable, whereas 32% said they'd be okay with it. But in general, support for monarchy is much lower in Scotland than it is in England. Have you got any recent figures on
I
that?
don't think there have been any recent polls on thoughts about the monarchy in Scotland and whether they should be retained or in general within in the British Isles. But I do hope, and I'm sure somebody will be doing those polls at the moment, and I'm sure they will be published soon. And I had another thought in the front of my head, and it's just in relation to something that you asked.
I'll just share you something Christopher Brookmeyer tweeted today. He said, with all these scandals, I think the monarchy is going to find it very difficult next time they face an election.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the next time that, for example, let's say that there is a referendum on an independent Scotland and Scotland decides that, yes, it does want to be independent, then there would have to be a referendum sometime soon after that on whether we do retain the monarchy or not. And these kinds of issues that we're going through now, or these kinds of problems that the royal family are having, I'm sure are going to feed into that debate. Mm-hmm. So it will have an impact, I think, in the end of the day.
Okay, let's move on, Brian. Thank you. Now, story which just reached us this afternoon, in fact, from the Scottish Government, we hear that official figures from Eurostat show that Scotland enjoys the best educated population in Europe, demonstrating that the country's education system has improved and performed better under the current Scottish Government. Excuse me. According to the independent Eurostat data, which also compiles data for non-EU states, Scotland has been number one for the percentage of 25 to 64-year-olds educated to degree level for every year between 2011 and 2009, which is the last year for which these figures are available. While there are no separate figures for England, comparison with Wales and Northern Ireland and the UK as a whole show that Scotland widened its performance gap after 2007 when the SNP came to power. Over the entire period for which comparative data is available, Scotland has had the largest increase among the UK nations. From 2007 to 2019, Scotland's performance has increased more and has also been well ahead of Labour-run Wales. Commenting, SNP's MSP Cock-up Stewart said, "These figures highlight the startling improvement in education since the SNP came to office and blow out of the water bogus claims made by opposition parties. We have an incredibly talented and well-educated workforce, which is hugely important for attracting inward investment, and another success story under the SNP, which exposes the dubiety of opposition's claims. Our universities are continually ranked among the very best in the world, and we have a reputation for innovation." So the time period here is, obviously the SNP emphasises it since they came to power, but the time period actually fits more closely the rolling out of the curriculum for excellence. Now, both you and me, Brian, missed that in our school years, but it was rolled out since 2010. So I guess that shows whatever might have been handled better. The EIS said we would like more resources to be put into the hands of teachers, who of course are responsible for delivering it locally. But nonetheless, that surely shows that it's producing results, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, there's not really very much that I have to offer on this. It's really just quite straightforward statistics and facts. But it's certainly good news. I mean, we often have heard the First Minister stand up in Holyrood and saying that she wanted to be judged on how she does in terms of education. And so I think she'll be quite pleased at these results, as will the Scottish Green government at the moment. You mentioned the Scottish Education Programme,
the Curriculum for
Excellence, yeah, which makes me then think about the recent PISA test figures, and PISA stands for the Programme for International Student Assessment, which have been quite controversial over recent years. And I think the PISA tests have been looking into how well or how poorly the Curriculum for Excellence has been doing, and they seem to come up with similar results. Scotland came out third out of 25 countries for the PISA tests in terms of what we used to call in our day the 3 Rs. So I just think it's interesting that this is a separate body that is coming up with similar results to the PISA tests. And it's maybe just mentioning that these new figures that you're quoting today in this news item, they came from Eurostat, which is the statistical office of the European Union. So it's quite a reliable source. Basically it's good news.
Yeah, the PISA figures have also praised Scottish education and the CFE curriculum for excellence for the way it has it's all about a skills-based education from what I understand, and it's all about having people ready, a workforce ready for the modern world, and it tends to be more about skills and less about rote learning. That's some of the criticism has been about rote learning, but do we need that these days with all the information available at our fingertips?
Well, yeah, as you say, in our day, we wouldn't have been allowed to take calculators into an examination room. Never mind.
Did they have calculators when I was at school, Brian?
Oh, slide rulers then, or abacus. Or I don't know how far back you need to go, Hugh, but I think I'm right in saying that kids are allowed to are they allowed? Well, they've got their mobile phones on them, and so they can basically look up basic facts. So I think it's...
Well, they could, yeah, I don't know, it'll be up to individual teachers. There might well be occasions where they find it handy to get people on Google, and there's probably occasions when they ask them to switch their phones off. But
with those kind of personal computers, it makes sense that education should change maybe and move away from rote learning to wider aspects.
Okay, just on that, just before we move on, also like you, I've been looking at it today, and the curriculum for excellence does actually attract a lot of interest around the world. In fact, Scottish educationalists have been advising other countries and suggesting how its gains could be implemented. So that's a good news story on Scottish education. Now on to disturbing news, Brian. Our next story, the UK security service MI5 has been forced to disclose top secret files to an investigation into historical operations in Northern Ireland for the first time, it has emerged. Revelations by the chief of an investigation into an alleged spy at the heart of the IRA comes as an influential US congressman denounced the British government's plans for an amnesty for those involved in crimes during the Troubles as a cover-up. John Butcher, former Chief Constable of Bedfordshire Police, has spent 5 years examining the involvements of a state agent codenamed Steak Knife in IRA kidnappings, torture and murder. He told the US Congress his Operation Canova investigation has now extended to 250 murders. He also told Congress he has made successful legal challenges to MI5 and was getting fresh information on crimes which had never been seen by previous police heads, including 3 official government inquiries led by reformer Met Commissioner John Stevens. We've recovered records that other investigations previously commissioned were not provided access to. We have access into MI5, into the military and into the PSNI. Direct access is something I've insisted upon, having spoken to a lot of those who previously led legacy investigations, he said. Mr. Butcher was speaking for the first time since he completed his interim reports into the killings, which is yet to be published. So it's interesting, Brian, that this revelation, the sort of thing that was rumoured a lot during the 70s and 80s of MI5 involvement in killings, it comes up from an American inquiry. So again, it shows you American involvement in the Irish connection is something that sometimes blindsides maybe the UK state.
Yeah, it's incredible. It kind of reads like something out of a Le Carre novel, and I think for me, basically, I think that there's always been rumours that the United Kingdom had infiltrated paramilitary organisations in Ireland and in Northern Ireland, and so it looks like we're finally getting evidence that really is the case, and that those rumours were perhaps true. Just thinking back to recent similar investigations into things like Bloody Sunday, I just think for myself, I just think that the families involved in this incident, they deserve the truth, and I hope that this story continues and the truth is out there.
Right, and that's an inquiry that continues in the US Congress. So let's move on, Brian. We're looking at the clock. We could do 2 hours as usual to do tonight's news justice, Brian, but we better move on. Back to the economic crisis in the UK, a story we've commented on before. Inflation in the UK increased to the highest rate for 3 decades in January as the impact of rising energy bills fed into a wide range of goods and services, adding to the squeeze on household living standards. New figures from the Office of National Statistics, the ONS, today revealed the annual rate of consumer price inflation rose to 5.5% in January. That's the highest since March 1992, with the Bank of England warning that the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, is likely to hit more than 7% in April. The latest increase is expected to heap further pressure on the government while putting the spotlight on the Bank of England to raise interest rates again. Businesses and consumer groups said the sharp rise in inflation would harm living standards and push more firms towards insolvency, while Labour and the unions said the government was failing to tackle the UK's worsening cost of living crisis. The SNP has said that Rishi Sunak is not doing anywhere near enough to tackle the UK cost of living crisis as inflation reaches its 30-year high. Commenting, the SNP's Shadow Chancellor Alison Thewlis MP said, "The Tory cost of living crisis is spiralling out of control, but the Chancellor has been posted missing. He's not doing anywhere near enough to get a grip and to support families." Households are already struggling from a toxic combination of Tory cuts, the aggressive tax hikes, and the soaring cost of Brexit and energy bills. With inflation rising and wages falling behind, the majority of families will be thousands of pounds worse off this year. Well, Brian, it's a good job we've got a Brexit bonus, eh? So in contrast to Europe, I've looked up today, the European Commission is making money available so that energy bills can be cut. Various taxes have been taken off energy bills, whereas, as we know, the Chancellor has given everybody a £200 loan at the same time as putting up national insurance. Right, so it's giving with one hand and taking away with, with two or three other hands.
Yeah, and I think you're absolutely right. For me, there's a very strong thread that runs all the way through this story, and that thread is the coloured Brexit. One of the things that we were repeatedly told by the likes of Michael Gove before the European referendum was that one of the things that we couldn't do as part of the European Union was to lower VAT on fuel bills. So we're now out of the EU, and the one thing that Sunak refuses to do is to cut VAT on fuel bills.
Ironically, that's what the EU is doing.
Absolutely, and I think also every individual country within the EU will be doing it. I mean, France is, the rise is 54% expected to be here in the UK, but in France they're going to make sure that the rise is minimised or capped and kept at 4% rise.
That's on your gas and electricity bills.
Yeah, and they're able to do that within the EU. And certainly here in Scotland, Kate Forbes, the finance minister in Holyrood, SNP finance minister, has agreed to give out £150 to 73% of households in Scotland via the council tax. Now, she's admitted that that's not enough and it's kind of a bit ham-fisted, but again, it's better than nothing. And again, the fact that the Westminster or Sunak is they don't call it a loan, but it is a loan. And it's enforced, it's whether you want it or not, and being paid back over time. It just shows that he could do a lot more, I think.
Yes, we were discussing, what do they call it? Yeah, clearly it is a loan. That's what everyone else calls it, but I can't remember what word the Chancellor used for it. But
yeah,
yes,
feel the sovereignty, basically. It's like, well, I can't feel it, but.
Oh, by the way, just before we move on, I noticed again the EU says that what we need to do in the long run, of course, is move on to renewables, so we're not at the mercy of these gas price increases. Yeah. Right, so I better move on. Sorry, okay. Brian, looking at the time here. Now, the SNP has today accused Scottish Tory MPs of putting their own career prospects ahead of the interests of their constituents, as pressure mounts on them to end their deafening silence over the misconduct of Boris Johnson. It comes after 5 Scottish Tory MPs have still refused to publicly back their Scottish Tory leader, Douglas Ross, and have failed to publicly state if they have submitted any no-confidence letters in the Prime Minister. Meanwhile, Douglas Ross found himself further isolated within his own party after it descended into chaos following reports that the Scottish Tories will invite Boris Johnson to give a keynote speech at their conference, despite demanding that he resigns. It was also reported in the Times that Tory sources warned that Johnson is increasingly being seen by party members as politically gangrenous, a limb to be chopped off, and that there is also increased frustration with the Scottish Conservative MP's inability and seeming unwillingness to articulate party members' concerns over the recent behaviour of the Prime Minister, commenting, SNP's MP Pete Wishart said, "The silence from the feeble 5 Scottish Tory MPs over misconduct from Boris Johnson is deafening." Yeah, this story is not going to go away, but I think Boris Johnson's not going to go away either. I mean, we've been commenting for a few weeks, Brian, on how long can the big dog survive. He's still there. I don't think it's going, is he, unless they have a disastrous May election campaign.
Even before you get to the May election campaign, for me, this is another one of those fascinating games of chess that is playing out right in front of our eyes in real time. Douglas Ross is an MP at Westminster, and he's also the leader of the Conservative Party here in Holyrood, so he's an MP and an MSP at the same time. He's stated that he does not support Boris Johnson, and this is what I'm trying to lay out here, trying to do it really quickly, is all in the run-up to the council elections coming up, and whatever way things turn out is going to affect what comes down the line at the council elections. So you've got two Conservative Party conferences happening at the same time, the Scottish Conservative Party conference and the nationwide, UK-wide Conservative Party conference. And I think they've purposely engineered that they both happen at the same time to kind of make sure that you're not going to get those awkward moments when Douglas Ross is in the same room as Boris Johnson at a Conservative Party conference. So I think they've both agreed to do that. But in longer term, if Boris Johnson survives, then I would say Douglas Ross is going to have to resign, because you can't have the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party being in complete opposition to the Prime Minister. And if Boris Johnson is unlucky and goes, then I would say Douglas Ross gets to stay. But whether Ross goes or Ross stays is going to have a big impact on how they are able to go into the Scottish elections. The worst of the two, I would say, was that if Boris Johnson stays and Douglas Ross stays, then how can they go into the council elections in May with that situation? I think one of them has to go. Just which one is it going to be?
Yes, you wonder if it's a case of the Conservatives, like Labour in London, really not interested in Scotland. Have they just written Scotland off?
Absolutely. Boris Johnson won't care whether Douglas Ross stays or goes, but I think it's going to have a huge impact on how they, how are they going to campaign if you've got the leader of the Scottish Conservative Party has said he has no confidence in the Prime Minister. It's an untenable situation, really. And if he does stay, then I think they're going to fall in the elections.
But the Prime Minister, doesn't need the feeble six.
Oh no,
anyway.
No, absolutely, it's of no consequence to Westminster at all. But up here, it's going to play out. It's going to be a lot.
Okay, so that's the latest on the Scottish Conservative Civil War. Let's see how that one plays out over the next couple of months, Brian. Okay, a health story now. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has confirmed that the Scottish Government has received JCVI advice recommending the universal vaccination of 5 to 11-year-olds. She said, although it has yet to be publicly published officially by the JCVI, like colleagues in Wales, we have received advice from a joint committee for vaccination and immunisation, which recommends COVID-19 vaccinations for all children aged 5 to 11 years. I can confirm, said the First Minister, that ministers have considered this draft advice and are content to accept its recommendations. Throughout the pandemic, it has been our intention that we follow the clinical and scientific evidence available to us. And I'd like to thank again the JCVI for their hard work in scrutinising the science and providing clear guidance. Ahead of a meeting of Cabinet Ministers and the Prime Minister this week, the Association of Directors of Public Health, that's the ADPH, have warned that Ministers' plans to scale back free PCR COVID tests could weaken the UK's defences should a new variant of the virus emerge, which results in significant new waves of cases. The ADPH said that despite the government being expected to roll back the last remaining COVID laws from next week, coronavirus was yet to become endemic, and added it was difficult to predict when this state may be attained. They warned that forcing people to pay for lateral flow tests would also have a detrimental impact on take-up, particularly among disadvantaged communities. So there's really two stories there, Brian. So there's vaccination of young school children, and also the prospect that testing, we might have to pay for it. So let's look at schools anyway. So Scotland and Wales will be offering vaccinations to primary school children. So that means, again, England is the odd one out. So have they abolished COVID in England?
Apparently so, or certainly it will be very, very soon. Just in general, I think, again, this is good news. I think everybody knows that schools are a source of contagion. It's very often that kids go to school and that's where they mix and mingle I'm getting distracted there. So yeah, but they would then pick up the disease and take it home to their family, where there might be people that are shielding or have underlying conditions. So it's good that will hopefully be addressed. And then I think anybody just who works in a school, teachers, supply teachers, support staff, I mean, just for their own safety, I'm sure it's going to be good that they're going to feel a great deal of relief knowing that these vaccinations are going to be getting rolled out. And as you say, I think this is going to help prevent, make it less likely that there's another new variant, which, let's face it, if that does come along, then that would be a disaster. As far as the testing and testing, whether we have to pay for them or not, again, if tests are, if you have to pay for tests, then people are going to stop testing. And if people stop testing, then we're not going to know where we are with this virus. And we keep being told that we're going to have to make our own decisions, informed decisions about whether to wear masks, whether to go to meetings with groups of people indoors and outdoors. How can you make those informed decisions if we don't know where we are in terms of the COVID? So I think it's really important that the devolved nations do not do what England is planning to do very soon, which is just to drop all restrictions and stop all publication of figures and ask people to pay for tests.
Okay, and just to remind everyone, we of course were tested. We've tested negative before we came to the studio today, and we'll continue to do that as long as there is significant community spread. We still have about 900 in hospital, something like that. Yeah. Although numbers are falling, but there's still quite a lot of community infection.
Yeah, it's maybe worth saying that people might have noticed that we don't give the daily figures anymore, and that's because, as you say, all the general trends are downwards, and but obviously, if that changes and the trends start to go upwards, then we will be reintroducing the daily figures again.
Yes, as you say, the fear is of a new strain. So, yes, all the medical experts are saying, well, because half of the planet, the WHO said last week, we're halfway through this pandemic. So the rest of the humanity still got it. And
it's also maybe just worth casting an eye towards Europe as well, because a lot of people in England, that are certainly at Westminster and the Conservative Party, they're saying, well, in Denmark they've already stopped all the restrictions. Nobody has to wear a mask and those kinds of things.
Netherlands will be doing that soon.
Yes, but the number of deaths in Denmark is skyrocketing at the moment. And also I think I'm right in saying, I meant to check this before coming on air, but I think I'm right in saying that that's true, that Denmark has sort of removed all restrictions, but one thing that they haven't done is to start charging for tests. So even they're not going that far, and Westminster, it seems, would be going even further than Denmark. So it's quite a sobering thought, thinking ahead.
Yep. So infections going down, but it's not away yet. We will be doing a weekly update on the Full Scottish on Sundays. So let's just swiftly move on. The European Court of Justice has dismissed complaints from Hungary and Poland against a law which ties EU funds to democratic standards. In a milestone in the battle for the rule of law in the EU, the bloc's highest court rejected the cases brought by Hungary and Poland in their entirety, confirming that countries can be deprived of EU funds if they fail to meet democratic standards. The EU's values, such as the rule of law, define the very identity of the European Union as a legal order, the court said in its statement today about its keenly anticipated ruling. The court specifies that compliance with those values cannot be reduced to an obligation which a candidate state must meet in order to accede to the European Union, and which it may disregard after accession. The ruling means that the European Commission can deny Hungary and Poland EU funds in response to the widely perceived democratic backsliding in both countries. The Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, who has been accused of dragging her feet on the issue, came under immediate pressure from across the political spectrum to use the law. No more excuses for von der Leyen. It's time to finally act against the rule of law violators in our union, said the German Green MMP Daniel Frund. Petra Sarvamaa, a Finnish MEP, Sarvamaa, a Finnish MEP and spokesperson on budgetary control for the centre-right EPP, the European People's Party, said, "It's high time to start implementing the regulation. The clock cannot be restarted to play for time. The Commission must act really fast." Hungary, named as only a partly free country by the NGO Freedom House, has provoked concerns about spending of EU funds by friends and family of the Prime Minister Viktor Orban. Poland's National Law and Justice Party, led by Jarosław Kaczynski, has been in a long-running battle with Brussels over the independence of its courts, which raises doubts about its stewardship of public money. The Commission is refusing to release €36 billion, that's about £30 billion, in coronavirus recovery funds to Poland and €7.2 billion to Hungary. But the current law could affect Warsaw and Budapest's access to the EU's 7-year budget, worth €1.8 trillion in the period from 21 to 27. Okay, so what we have here, Brian, is I think for the first time accusations that member states are not keeping up with the spirit of EU law, which is basically about, in this case, it's about democracy, it's about rights of citizens, and it's about freedom of judges, free from political interference. So have you got anything on? Let's look at Hungary, first of all, which is passing a new act about, it's a repressive act about gay LGBTQ rights, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't have much to go on Hungary, but it certainly does remind me of what we had here in the UK when we had Section 28, which was brought in by the Conservative government under Margaret Thatcher. And just casting my mind back to that, I decided to do a quick search to remind myself of that. And Section 28 wasn't repealed in this country until 2003, which, I was there, I remember, but I thought it was further back than that, so that was quite shocking. But certainly, and again, thinking about this situation in terms of the referendum that we've been through recently, in terms of the European referendum, I can certainly imagine the likes of Nigel Farage and Michael Gove saying that this is a classic example of an undemocratic European Union and how you've got a loss of sovereignty if you're in the EU. But I have to say that I agree with what some of these countries have stated. It is about shared values and it is about democracy, and I kind of wish that the UK was still in the EU so that we could likewise press for these values.
It's interesting that the spokesperson we quoted earlier on is from the EPP. That's actually the European Parliament's Conservative Party. So even ordinary centre-right politicians in Europe believe that Orban has gone too far.
Yeah, and again, I didn't get a chance to dig down into it, but I was thinking about the last time that the EU was accused of being undemocratic and being a bully, and that was, of course, towards Greece. But it's a completely different scenario, which was, I wish I could give a more informed comparison. But I think this is one of the good things about the European Union is that different countries can stand together and promote human rights and do the right thing in common decency. I think it is important that countries work together, and if you've got an economic union like the European Union.
It's about, in this case, it's about political rights and, what Orban is accused of really is basically behaving in a corrupt and an undemocratic way, as well as being, in fact, passing laws which reduce the rights of LGBT citizens. That, of course, goes against the spirit of European laws. But the other issue, of course, is about the supremacy. I guess that's what you mean by UKIP and Farage. If you join the European Union, then your own national legislation has to come second to EU legislation. But that's the rule you accept when you join the club.
And not to do with every issue. It's just that you do give up some sovereignty in order to make the European Union work. That there has to be some kind of pooling and sharing, and you have to have common values and agree to have certain things that match across standards that match across the European Union. It's just maybe interesting that at these times, instead of it being about the voltage of plugs or washing machines or kettles that mean that things can trade freely because everything's built to the same standard. It's interesting that this is extending to values, and that hopefully it's a good thing. I think that these are good values that should be promoted. And if we've got an opportunity, if the EU has an opportunity to take a stand, then I would say that's a good thing for human rights.
Well, in fact, they finally, yes, they've been forced to do that. Okay, and just finally on that, Viktor Orban is in fact standing for elections, so the Hungarian elections will be coming up in a couple of months, so we'll see what happens then. Him and his party, Fidesz, have a large majority in the parliament in Budapest, so we'll see. We'll report on that when it comes up. Our final story tonight, we hear from the Scottish Government that financial support will be made available to help crofters and farmers on Scotland's islands effectively manage local populations of the grey lag geese. In some locations, an increase in numbers of geese has caused significant agricultural damage to barley crops and improved pasture from cropping being eaten and trampled. To address these issues, the Scottish Government is providing further funding to existing adaptive management projects in Orkney, Uist, Lewis and Harris and Tyree and Coll. These projects, established by Nature Scot in 2012, help local communities to control goose populations and reduce their impacts on agricultural activity and unique habitats while retaining their conservation interest. Environment and Land Reform Minister Mary McCallan visited Rinnebister Farm in Orkney to announce the funding and meet farmers and members of the NFUS. Ms McCallan said, "I have listened to the concerns of farmers and crofters in Orkney, Lewis, Harris, Uist, Tyree and Coll about the difficulty they have in controlling resident grey lag populations. That's why we are contributing up to £50,000 towards resident grey lag goose control on these islands over the next 2 years to mitigate the impact on agriculture and support unique and important habitats." Well, we'll not spend a lot of time discussing that, but it just shows you the complications of environmental policy, because sometimes species can get out of control. For instance, stags, there's too many stags and deer, they have to be managed. So anything you'd like to add to that, Brian, before we move on?
No, I totally agree. I think that there is some kind of ecological element to this, and as you say, deer in Scotland now, I think in some quarters are considered to be pests, and they damage young trees. We're trying to reforest Scotland, and yet the overpopulated deer population are kind of like hampering that, and it sounds like that's something similar to do with grey lag geese. In general, I would say this is a good example of levelling up within Scotland, because I think Holyrood is often accused of being too central belt centric, and I think this is a perfect example of the kind of things that maybe Holyrood needs to do more of, to make sure that if you live in the Highlands and Islands, then you don't feel that you're being left behind. So again, in general, it's a good thing, but yeah, it probably is something that's got some kind of climate change, ecological problem at its root, I would hazard to guess.
Okay, well, we'll move on to, well, in fact, we'll wind up tonight, Brian. So it's been a pleasure to present the programme again with my colleague, Brian Liddy. And can I, just before we finish, go back to that story earlier on about Scotland having more people with a degree than anywhere else in Europe. So I guess, Brian, that means we're probably addressing right now the most educated television audience anywhere in Europe. So thank you for joining us and thank you for supporting. If you want to become one of our supporters and keep our shows on the air, then look at the link right here. And so if you join for £5 a month, you can become one of our regular subscribers and supporters and help us to make independent programmes, independent broadcasting and news for Scotland. So that's about it from me and Brian tonight. So thanks for watching Scotland at 7, and I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks. Bye.